right, guys, I have to confess, as a Canadian, I love rhubarb. Rhubarb is amazing, and one of the things that I've noticed about living in the South is rhubarb is really hard to grow in the South. Back home in Canada, it grows like a weed. I had it on the side of a garage that had no love whatsoever. In fact, the car probably drove over it a few times, but it came back every year after minus 30 degrees Celsius weather. It would come back every year in a giant flourish, and we would have tons of rhubarb. But in the South, I've committed so much plant murder just trying to keep a few plants alive. But today I have 3 plants that are growing right now, one of which has been alive for almost 3 years now, and one has been alive for it's on its 2nd season here. So I'm going to talk about what I've learned about growing rhubarb in the South, and I think you can actually grow it, but it takes a lot of babying of the plant. Let's take a look. So these are 2 of my rhubarb plants. This particular one is a Victoria variety. This is more common, probably this kind of variety is what I would see back home in Canada quite a bit. This is a variety you'll see very commonly online. You can easily get seeds for it. In fact, this particular one was started by seeds. This one here is kangaroo. This one came from Gurney seeds, and it's actually developed specifically to tolerate more heat. This one is made for a zone, I think it's 4 to 8, and this one here is for a zone 3 to 7. So we are in a zone 8.5, so that creates a bit of a complexity for growing because we're a bit outside of their ideal grow zone. But that doesn't mean that I don't want to try to make it happen. I love rhubarb. I love a good rhubarb crisp, so that's the goal, is to try and keep rhubarb alive in the South. So first off, what is a rhubarb? Rhubarb is a vegetable, not a fruit. Most people will commonly think that it is a fruit. You kind of eat it in a sweet way, like you would with strawberries in a pie, but it is actually a vegetable. For rhubarb, you want to eat the stems. The leaves are toxic, so you don't want to be eating any of the leaves. The stems itself are what you're eating on a rhubarb. Even the stems can carry a little bit of the toxicity in them, but not in an amount that's unedible. It's actually no different than spinach or cabbage. They all carry a bit of a toxin to them, but that still remains edible. You can compost the leaves. It has no impact on your compost. It breaks down naturally and then it's fine. But for eating, you just want to make sure you're only eating the stems. And you don't want to eat the stems if they go mushy or if they get damaged. At that point, there's a chance that those will actually become toxic as well. I've enjoyed a lot of rhubarb and it's been just lovely. So certainly not one to worry too much about. So for 5 years, I've been growing rhubarb plants in the South, each year killing them over and over again, and only in the last couple of years have I been able to keep this Victoria alive, and easily I've been able to keep this kangaroo alive. The kangaroo variety has been easier to keep alive, I have found, than the Victoria variety, but I have been giving it the same babying treatment. And babying is key here because I really baby these rhubarb plants. If you want to grow them in the South, this is a plant that you can't just plunk in the ground and let it grow. It does take some serious babying. Let's talk about the 3 things that I think are key in keeping these rhubarb plants alive. The first one has been in the fact that I've grown them in pots and not in the ground. I have yet to see or been able to myself get any of them successfully to live in the ground. This kangaroo variety, I'm too nervous to actually put it in the ground. I'm going to buy another one to put in the ground to test it out in the future, but for now I've kept it in the pot because I know I can trust that I can keep the conditions well managed through a pot. What pots allow you to do is move them around in your conditions. So rhubarb actually prefers a lot of sunlight. It likes the sun. It can tolerate a bit of shade, but in general it's mostly grown in the sun. In the South, in the summer, you can get a heck of a lot of sun, but so much heat, and they cannot tolerate that much heat. So you have to move them into the shade. So this means you're either putting them in a spot that they get like an afternoon shade or something like that, or for me, I'm moving them in and out of the sun and the shade. In some cases, they're getting a lot of shade during the heat of the summer. In the spring, these guys can sit out in full sun for the entire time. I don't need to hide them from the sun because it's cooler, the temperatures are better. However, we do get a lot more rain, and rain is actually not a good thing when it's in large volume for rhubarb plants. In the winter time, I will move these guys into the greenhouse in a deep freeze Frost is no problem, it can totally handle that, but because they're in a pot, I don't trust them in a deep freeze to be at the super low temperatures. So I moved them into the greenhouse to protect them. If they were in the ground, I wouldn't worry about it. For sure, the Victoria variety in Canada would live through super freezes, no problem. So it can definitely tolerate a freeze, but that was in the ground and certainly not in a pot. So with pots, it allows you to control how much water and how much sun, and often in many cases, how much heat they will get. The other item with these guys is water. Too much water is really detrimental to a rhubarb plant. They like consistent moisture. They don't want to dry out completely. They'd like to be kept moist, but they don't and absolutely cannot be soggy. I would say too much water has been a significant reason why I've killed a lot of plants, almost more so than the heat. Once I mastered the fact that in the high temperatures I had to get them shifted into the shade, I would then overcompensate for the heavy heats of the south and water them too much, which would then rot out this whole system. So what I do now is I only water them when with a water tester. So I got this guy, I'll put a link in my description down below. And you can see this guy's at 5, looks like it's going to be, around 5, almost 4.8 for watering. I would not water here until it was probably around about 2. So we'll check him. He's at a 3.6. I probably won't water him quite yet. So managing the heat, managing the moisture, and being able to move them around, I think, are the 3 main keys of keeping rhubarb alive in the south. Once we are in the heat of the summer, these guys are absolutely being put into the shade. Feeding these plants isn't too difficult. In the springtime when they start to emerge, you can give them a balanced fertilizer, a 10-10-10 kind of fertilizer, or an organic fertilizer, whatever you're using. I usually use an AgriThrive fertilizer. You can also use a little bit of compost, but be careful how heavy your compost is. Compost, I find, often retains moisture really well, and unfortunately too much moisture will kill these guys. So I use a fast draining soil with them for the most part. What about the method of growing rhubarb like annuals? That is something that seems to be commonly recommended down here in the south. I'm not sure I get why you would do that. I certainly haven't tried it, so I can't speak for whether or not it truly works. But as a person who's had rhubarb growing for quite some time, off and on over 5-year period from a starting stage, rhubarb isn't very big when it first develops in the first year. The second year it gets a bit bigger, and in the third year it really starts to flourish. So I'm not sure why somebody would grow it as an annual, because you really aren't getting the stalks that you would need to have a good rhubarb, in my opinion anyways, but I certainly haven't done it, so I can't make that claim wholeheartedly. So I will continue to grow the 2 rhubarbs that I have now today in these pots, while my next goal or my next test will be to get the kangaroo variety again from Gurney once it's back in stock, and grow one in the ground to see if we can make that happen with that specific variety. All right, you guys, that's it. If you have any tips for growing rhubarb in the south, or if you just love rhubarb in general like I do, give me a comment down below. Otherwise, be friendly, be kind.